My Govanen. Welcome to Tolkien Lore Channel. I'm the Tolkien Geek, and this is continuing the Silmarillion Synopsis series. This will be the 11th video, and you'll probably remember at the end of the 10th video we left off with Feanor sailing across the sea back to Middle-earth, deserting Fingolfin and his people on the shores of Aman, and Finarfin had led some of the Noldor back to basically seek the pardon of the Valar and repent of their attempt to leave Valinor in the first place. Fingolfin finds his way across the far northern reaches in the Helcaraxë, the grinding ice, and that's the last thing we know. The next chapter is going to basically tell us what's been going on in Beleriand this whole time, while all these other events have been taking place in Valinor. So let's get started and find out what's been going on back in Middle-earth. Stretching back our memories a bit, you may remember that Elwe, the former king of the Teleri who had gotten lost, ended up marrying Melian the Maya, and eventually came back out of the woods, and the Elves found him. And it tells us that the Elves of Beleriand now acknowledge him as their king, and we're talking about all of Beleriand. This includes Círdan the shipwright, who is, basically on the shores. They were the ones that had stuck around even when the rest of the Teleri left because they had come to love the sea so much. And you've got all these other elves wandering from basically one end of Beleriand to the other. They all acknowledge Elwë as their king. Under his lordship, he had seen the trees, and with the wisdom of Melian, who of course was a Maya and had lived in Valinor for a long time, they become the wisest of the elves of Middle-earth and become known as the Sindar, or the Grey Elves. And they're kind of a half step between your typical Morroquindi or Dark Elves and the Calaquindi or Light Elves who all went to Valinor and saw the light of the trees. There's a big difference between those two groups, and the Sindar make kind of a middle ground. Now it tells us that most of Middle-earth is still kind of under the sleep of Yavanna because there's no light, and she had kind of put everything to sleep, waiting for something to happen later on, while Melkor was kind of ruling in Middle-earth. And even after they captured Melkor, that still holds true. But in the region where Melian and Elwe, who is now known as Elu Thingol, or the King Greymantle — Thingol means Greymantle — it tells us that in their realm, which is basically the forest of Neldoreth and Region, there is some growth going on there because of, I suppose, the presence of Melian herself. Now, at the end of the first age of Melkor's imprisonment in Valinor, remember he was in prison for 3 ages, at the end of that first age, Luthien is born to Thingol and Melian, and it tells us that at her birth, there are flowers that come forth to greet her. So that kind of presages how special she's going to be. During the second age of Melkor's imprisonment, it tells us that dwarves finally make their way into Beleriand. It doesn't really tell us when they awoke or much of anything like that, because of all of this is written from an elvish perspective, and the elves whose stories we read are basically the Noldor and the Grey Elves of Beleriand. But the dwarves make their way into Beleriand in this time period, and we learn that they had basically already made these, big halls and dwellings off into the east, and it mentions 2 in the Blue Mountains named Belegost and Nogrod in the Elvish tongue. Dwarves have their own names for them, and there's, basically kind of like common tongue / English equivalents. But these are in the Blue Mountains, which, if you pay attention, you'll notice that the Blue Mountains, which are in the far east of Beleriand, are actually the same Blue Mountains that are in the far west of Middle-earth as we know it in The Lord of the Rings. So if you look at where the Grey Havens are, there's this gap in this mountain range in the west of Middle-earth in The Lord of the Rings, and that's the Blue Mountains. Here, the Blue Mountains are just a continuous range in the far east of Beleriand. So that's kind of significant. But it also tells us there's other dwarf dwellings, and one of them is the Dwerodelf, or Khazad-dûm, or as the elves call it, Hadodrond. And the elves of Beleriand really only kind of know of it as kind of a rumor because it's far to the east relative to where they are. And it tells us that dwarves start making inroads and literal roads into Beleriand and start trafficking there. It tells us that You know, at this point, there's nothing really between the dwarves and elves that makes them dislike each other, but it hints that there will be something later. But they're not exactly the best of friends either. They kind of name the elves the Naugrim, the stunted people, because they're short and they're not the best looking. The elves don't really get the dwarvish language, and the dwarves aren't really keen on teaching their language anyway. But the dwarves quickly learn the elvish language, and so they just tend to use that when they do commerce. And it tells us that the dwarves, you know, after making these roads into Beleriand and start trafficking, even though they don't have any reason to dislike each other per se, their friendship with the Sindar is always a little bit cool. They're not great buddies. And it tells us that when the Noldor will eventually arrive, they'll actually be better friends with the Noldor because they kind of have the same interests, and because the Noldor are, you know, really friends with Aule, and of course, Aule is the one who made the dwarves. So, I mean, there's a bit more of a connection there. But that's kind of just the introduction to the dwarves that we get. Now, at the end of Melkor's second age of imprisonment, Melian, who of course, being a Maya, is a little bit more prescient than probably most, and may even be more prescient than most Maiar, I should say. She basically tells Thingol, you know, the peace that we're experiencing right now is not going to last, so you should be ready for things to get worse. And so, as a result of this, Thingol basically enlists the dwarves to kind of help him make, you know, a fortified dwelling of his own, similar to theirs. And they find this place that's kind of there's a place at the edge of a river where they make basically a huge underground system of caverns, which is called, because of its size, the Thousand Caves, or Menegroth in the Elven tongue. And basically there's this one entrance to it which you have to get to via a bridge over the river. And those of you who know your Hobbit really well will probably notice that this sounds rather a lot like the dwelling of the Elven King in Mirkwood, so interesting connection there. At any rate, the dwarves help do this. Like many of the things that they do, they always ask for a price. The Elven King Thingol actually gives them this really huge pearl and some other stuff, and Melian teaches them a lot of the things that they're interested in, but they also do the work just as a passion project, because it tells us that at this time the dwarves were still young and eager to achieve things. And so once they get done doing that, they've got this fortified dwelling, and it's really kind of the only place in Beleriand we learn that there's a lot of people living in one place, other than where Círdan and the other shore dwelling elves are. Most of the other elves just kind of wander around in not really large communities. But in Menegroth itself, we've got this huge system of underground caverns, which serves as both home and fortress. And because of the skill of the dwarves and the elves working there, they make basically the underground look almost like, you know, something above ground. There's stone columns that they carve to look like trees. They carve the likeness of animals. Melian and others weave tapestries and things for, you know, to beautify the place. And it tells us that this is actually the fairest dwelling of any king east of the sea, which is interesting because later we'll learn about another place that's pretty awesome, but it doesn't say that about that place. So Menegroth is pretty special. Now, during the third age of Melkor's imprisonment, the dwarves begin to tell news to the Sindar of evil things further to the east in Middle-earth, basically saying that, you know, the war that the Valar made against Melkor didn't get rid of every bad thing, and now the evil is kind of starting to grow again, and it's starting to make inroads and really bother the dwarves and the elves that dwell east of the Blue Mountains. Eventually, these evil things, including orcs, begin to make their way into Beleriand itself and start to cause trouble. And so, again, Thingol kind of enlists the help of the dwarves to begin making weapons and chainmail. And it tells us actually that chainmail is an invention of the dwarves. They're the first beings to come up with this particular type of armor. And it also tells us that in this and in the forging of steel, they're basically unmatched, or at least not exceeded by anybody else, even the Noldor. So, and it also tells us dwarves have always kind of by nature been a warlike people, so it's not really necessarily surprising that they're pretty good at making weapons, whereas prior to this point, Thingol and the Grey Elves haven't really had a reason to have weapons. Some of them had, bows for hunting and that sort of thing, but not really steel weapons. But at any rate, with the help of the dwarves making, steel weapons and chainmail and things of that nature, we get enough of a armed force that Thingol can kind of drive out the evil things from Beleriand, and for a while it has peace again. Just as a side note, it tells us that especially the dwarves of Nogrod are particularly good at weapon forging, and it mentions that the greatest of the dwarven weaponsmiths is Telkar, who you may know is the person who made the sword Narsil, which later becomes Anduril, which is Aragorn's sword. So, interesting side note. Here it also reminds us that some of the elves who had begun the journey toward the west, but later kind of dropped off, probably east of the Misty Mountains, um, under their leader at that time was Linway, but it tells us that some of those, being afraid of the evil things that are now wandering around in Middle Earth, and hearing of Thingol and his realm and the peace that's there, they finally make their way west of the Blue Mountains under the leadership of Denethor, the son of Linway. Denethor being a name you really should know if you know anything about Lord of the Rings. So this is the first instance of that name, actually. Denethor is not a man's name originally, it's an elf's name, and you'll find that a lot if you read the Silmarillion, you'll see that trend a lot. Anyway, they make their way into Beleriand. They kind of settled just to the west of the Blue Mountains in a realm called Osiriand, which is basically the land of 7 rivers. There's these 7 rivers that flow west from the mountains down to this one big river that then flows south. And they kind of settle there, and the Grey Elves under Thingol basically treat them as long lost kin, which they are. And so they're happy to add them to their people, but they don't really join with Thingol's people in Menegroth over in the forest. They stay further over to the east. Finally, one last thing it tells us that happens during this period, the elven minstrel and the chief lore master of Thingol's realm, Dairun, he devises first these Kirth or runes that basically for use in writing, and it tells us that mostly the writing wasn't really a thing that they were concerned with because elves live forever and they can remember things, but because of the evil things that start happening, of course, you start to realize not everything's going to last, and you do need to keep records. And it tells us that, ironically, though, the dwarves actually thought more of his invention than he did, partially because the Kirth that he devises are really good for etching in stone. If you remember, say, the runes from The Hobbit, this is those kind of runes. They're very straight-edged, not very, curvy, elegant, and graceful. And so they make really, really good letters for carving into stone or metal or that sort of thing. So the dwarves are really happy about this, more so even than the elves. Before I continue on, there is this one really nice passage that kind of sums up where the state of Beleriand is at this point. And it's a very, very almost poetic passage, and I just wanted to read it because it's a very nice summation of where we are before I get to things getting worse. In Beleriand in those days the elves walked, and the rivers flowed, and the stars shone, and the night flowers gave forth their scents, and the beauty of Melian was as the noon, and the beauty of Luthien was as the dawn in spring. In Beleriand King Thingol upon his throne was as the lords of the Maiar, whose power is at rest, whose joy is as an air that they breathe in all their days, whose thought flows in a tide untroubled from the heights to the deeps. And Beleriand still at times rode Orome the Great, passing like a wind over the mountains, and the sound of his horn came down the leagues of the starlight, and the elves feared him for the splendor of his countenance and the great noise of the onrush of Nahar. But when the Valaroma echoed in the hills, they knew well that all evil things were fled far away. So I just wanted to read that. Now let's start going downhill. Now, of course, Melkor eventually was released from prison and made his way back into Middle-earth, as we have already discussed, now being called Morgoth by the Noldor, and he makes his way there with Ungoliant. Whenever he gets his little argument with Ungoliant about, her payment, and then he eventually screams because Ungoliant is about to do him in, or at least do something really nasty to him, his scream can be heard all across Beleriand. The elves don't know what it is, but they know it ain't good. So they hear this, and they're all really afraid of what's going on. But, of course, Morgoth escapes, and Ungoliant eventually flees from the Balrogs, who rescue Morgoth. And it tells us that she flees to the south and tries to enter into the realm of Thingol, but Melian, with her power, keeps her out. Ungoliant then flees back northward to this mountain range, and the area around this mountain range that was at one time called Dorthonion, which is basically relation to the pine trees that grow there. And after she goes there and starts breeding more and more spiders, it becomes really, really nasty place and becomes the Ered Gorgoroth, the Mountains of Terror, and really nobody wants to go there. The waters are poisoned, it's dark, and sunlight doesn't really get in there. After this, of course, also Morgoth begins rebuilding his fortress of Angband. He raises 3 huge mountains called the Thangorodrim over the gates of Angband and begins multiplying orcs. So things start building up to some real nastiness. The orcs eventually kind of just come forth suddenly, in the darkness. You have to remember at this point, Middle-earth is still all dark. There's nothing but starlight to, light up anything. So the orcs eventually kind of attack, kind of in secret. They kind of snuck around, and because of the nature of how Menegroth and Círdan the Shipwright are really the only large settlements, they kind of cut those two off from each other and make a lot of inroads in places. And so at this point, Thingol calls on Denethor from the east to come help, and now we're going to get to the first great battle in the Wars of Beleriand. So Denethor and Thingol attack an eastern branch of the army of the orcs, and between them they basically crush them. But unfortunately, the elves under Denethor, unlike the elves of Thingol who had, metal weapons and armor with the help of the dwarves, the elves with Denethor were still basically using bows and really light armor and weapons. And so they took some pretty heavy casualties, and Denethor himself was killed before Thingol could come to him. But Thingol, after this, just basically crushed the rest of the orcs, and those that escaped were waylaid by the dwarves fleeing north. But after this, the elves that were with Denethor, they were kind of reticent to do much of anything else in terms of open war, so they kind of just mostly hide out in the trees in Osiriand, dress in camouflage, basically green and brown and that sort of thing, and basically conduct themselves by stealth instead of open war. And because of this, they become known as the Green Elves, or the Lyquindi. Some of them, though, do actually end up going with Thingol at this point back to Menegroth and joining his people. Unfortunately, Thingol, after this victory, learns that the western branch of the orc army has been victorious against Círdan and has basically closed him up in his settlements, and at this point he's basically shut off. And so Thingol withdraws basically all of his people into Menegroth and the forests of Neldorith and Region, and Melian at this point uses her, I hesitate to use the word magic, Tolkien probably wouldn't like that, but for lack of a better term, power, I guess, basically puts forth what's called the Girdle of Melian. Basically, it's a ring of enchantment around Thingol's realm, which if you try to enter into it, you just become bewildered and lost. So it's that nobody can really get in unless Thingol and Melian want them to get in. And at that point, his realm becomes known as Doriath, the land of the girdle, because there's this girdle of Melian protecting it. And so it becomes by far one of the most protected places in Middle-earth. And we'll see that continue even when the Noldor come back, and it becomes rather significant. And as a final note, of course, the chapter leaves off reminding us, all this really bad stuff is going on, but the Noldor are about to return. So we're going to get, these two worlds colliding in a little bit. But the next chapter doesn't actually get us there. It actually gives us another meanwhile as events are unfolding. So we'll have to come back to the Noldor a bit later. So that's our look at what's been happening in Middle-earth while all these other events have been unfolding in the west in Valinor. Hope you enjoyed that. Hope it filled in a lot of details and maybe gave you some hints as to things that may have been hinted at in The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings that now you've got a little more information. And of course, some of the stuff is being hinted at that will happen later too, so keep those in mind. But if you enjoyed the video, please do give it a thumbs up. Please do share it around. If you want to know more about Tolkien and the worlds he created, of course, you can follow the channel. You can subscribe over here. And don't forget to click that bell icon to make sure you get notifications. My Patreon is over on this side, and you can find a couple of previous videos up here. And of course, you can follow me on Twitter at JRRTLore. Until next time, I'm the Tolkien Geek signing out for the Tolkien Lore channel. Namarie.